You're listening to MuniCast, the podcast that discusses municipal leadership. MuniCast is brought to you by SaskTel's innovation and collaboration team. SaskTel can help you sort through the noise to create solutions that add value quickly, whether it's reducing your environmental footprint, driving investment, community development, or just saving money. Contact your SaskTel account manager to find out more. MuniCast is hosted by SUMA, the voice of Saskatchewan's hometowns. I'm Stephanie, SUMA's Education and Events Advisor, and I'm joined today by Sean McKenzie, SUMA's Director of Advocacy Services, for this bonus episode of MuniCast. Today we're speaking with David Coletto, Chair, CEO, and founder of Abacus Data, a full-service market research and strategy firm based in Ottawa and Toronto. We look forward to welcoming David as the keynote speaker at the 2024 SUMA Convention and Trade Show happening April 14th to 17th in Regina. David and his partners founded Abacus Data 13 years ago, and since then it has grown into one of Canada's most respected market research firms. David has spent much of his professional career exploring and measuring public opinion as it relates to housing, quality of life, public policy, and capturing the mood of Canadians. He has worked with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, the Canadian Real Estate Association, the Ontario Real Estate Association, and many others. He earned a PhD in political science from the University of Calgary in 2010 and is an adjunct professor at Carleton University. He is the host and producer of In Focus with David Coletto, a new podcast that explores the intersection of public opinion, politics, public policy, and consumer behavior. Welcome, David. Thank you very much for joining us for this podcast.
Peter, Stephanie, and Sean, thanks for having me.
The SUMA Convention and Trade Show draws elected officials and administration from urban municipalities throughout Saskatchewan, and we're looking forward to you joining us as the keynote speaker this year in Regina. You've spent much of your professional career exploring and measuring public opinion and done work with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities. How will you be using these experiences to guide your keynote?
I've an appreciation, an understanding, I think, of many of the challenges that municipalities right across the country are facing. And I think in Saskatchewan, you're no exception. You know, you are having to carry much of the, I'm going to call it the load of growth. And whether that be, the infrastructure required to meet the housing demands that are happening, whether that's shifts in populations, all of those kinds of things are happening at the local level. And yet policymakers in Regina or in Ottawa may not, truly both respect and perhaps respond to that kind of responsibility. And so, my work with FCM and some other municipalities specifically and other organizations, I think brings a good context to understanding what's unique about municipalities and the kinds of challenges, both and opportunities, I think, that exist for them in the world today.
And as you know, your audience at the SUMA Convention are Saskatchewan's elected municipal officials and staff. How do you see your message being valuable to Saskatchewan's municipalities?
Well, I think it all starts with just an understanding of, and what I try to do is an understanding of where the public is. I'm a public opinion researcher. I get to ask thousands of Canadians hundreds of questions every week, from things around public policy to politics to the consumer market to even how they feel about where they work. And so I think I've got a pretty good sense of what's making both folks in Saskatchewan but across the country tick. What's keeping them up at night? What gets them excited these days? And I think bringing that perspective to bear on explaining the world we're in right now. And why are things moving in certain directions? And also, my goal is to take a sense of where people are today and try to project where will they be, 6 months from now, maybe 18 months. We may have a federal election 18 months from now. What is the implications of that? And you also have a provincial election coming up this year in Saskatchewan that doesn't look like it should change a government, but you never know. And so how do you make sense of those possible shifts that are happening? That's what I think someone in my position who gets to ask lots of people questions can bring to the conversation.
Thanks. And David, in your work, you explore the intersection of public opinion, politics, public policy, and consumer behavior. But can you give us a bit of a high-level overview of how these areas are interconnected in your mind and what that means for the political landscape at the municipal level?
Yeah, I guess great question, Sean. It starts for me with like perception. And I always say to people, I live in the world of perception, not reality. What does that mean? Well, I think it's really important for any leader, anyone who's trying to shape public policy, who's trying to bring along a population to get buy-in on a decision, to understand where people are and why they think what they do. And perception is a big part of it, right? So whether it's how people vote, whether they support a new development, whether it's opposition to an idea that governments have, are driven by what they think is happening and how they think the world is actually working. So I start there. And then so once you understand what people think about something, you can then understand how do you get them to either follow you, how do you mobilize them, and also how do you identify the possible risk of people rising up in opposition to some idea. And so that intersection between the broader public opinion landscape, how that might lead them to political behavior. So whether that be formally voting in an election, whether that be picking up a phone or sending an email to their elected representatives, whether it might be showing up at the ledge or at City Hall protesting a decision, all of those kinds of behaviors are driven by those initial perceptions, which then, I think importantly, leads to either pressure or a lack of pressure on governments themselves to make decisions. So if you understand that kind of process from how people kind of filter and digest the information and news that they're getting about what's happening in their municipality, what might be happening in the province or nationally, I think you then you can have a good sense of both how to, if you're somebody who wants to motivate that group and get them to do something, or you may want to understand how to prevent a kind of, I'll call it a backlash. So I think there's a powerful intersection, and I think a lot of the world makes sense, I think, when you unpack it that way. And I'm excited to share that in the talk in April.
How do you feel the political landscape has changed recently, and what do you think are the driving factors behind those changes?
Well, I think we have seen significant change. I think in the last 6 months, at the national level, we have seen, for example, the Conservative Party stake out very clear lead in the so-called horse race that we pollsters like to ask about. If an election were held today, how would you vote? I actually think that's the least interesting question we ask. It's the one that gets often the most attention. What I think is more interesting is the longer term trend that we've seen, which is at the national level and across many provinces. And I think Saskatchewan is not immune to these forces, is in a world where the cost of everything has gone up, where scarcity feels more real to people. And when I say scarcity, I mean not just, things that, food because it's more expensive, or housing because it's increasingly expensive, but also healthcare. Where I live in Ontario anyways, emergency department or room wait times are at historic levels. There's a sense that the healthcare system is at capacity. I don't think any province is immune to that, and I think it's likely happening everywhere. So that sense of scarcity changes people's outlook, and it changes how we interact with each other and in our politics. There was a study that came out of Harvard University that described how zero sum thinking gets formed, and zero sum thinking basically says that if I'm somebody who feels like I'm losing out, it means that somebody else is winning, and it creates that kind of conflict that we see. And it gets sent up to our politics. So I think the shift in mindset, and the way I describe it is in 2018, I think generally speaking, people were generally optimistic. The economy was doing okay. Inflation was under control. Yeah, climate change and some bigger issues were around us. Then the pandemic happened, and for a moment there, we were very scared, then relieved, but still anxious. Coming out of the pandemic, it became one around shortage, because a lot of the things we wanted and needed, we just couldn't get. And I think we've now entered a period of scarcity. And so that is creating a lot of challenges for incumbent governments, and whether that be the federal government, who is under the most pressure right now, but I think also provincial governments as well are trying to navigate this world. And I'll end with, I don't think municipal leaders are immune either. And so all of these kinds of forces are just making governing much harder today, I think, than it was even just a few years ago.
I think that point about scarcity is a great point, David, and certainly one that we see an awful lot at the municipal level in particular because of the limited number of financial tools that municipalities have, primarily existing on a combination of property taxes and then grants from other levels of government. So when other levels of government are going through fiscally challenging times, there isn't a whole lot trickling down, or if there is, there's a great deal of criticism over what's trickling down at the same time. I want to pull a little bit on that thread of scarcity, though, and I wonder what your thoughts are in terms of the change of political discourse that we've really seen, and this is over a number of years now, certainly, and probably due at least in part to the rise of social media. But it feels like a lot of the time there's very little policy being debated and a great deal of politics being debated. Going for the soundbite that's going to sound the best, trying to lampoon the other leaders. And whereas that's not new, it seems to be a focus of behavior at this point. Do you feel like that not only comes out of the rise of social media, but also the scarcity, or are those two not connected in your mind?
Yeah, I think it's things are coming together to create a perfect storm of polarization, right? Let's call it that. And I think, Sean, you touched on, I don't think the cause, I think there's always this is my belief, human instinct is to, become tribal, to look for scapegoats, to get kind of, the friction is something that's easily induced. But for most of, at least my life, until social media came along, it wasn't easy to just kind of isolate yourself and live in an echo chamber that's just constantly reinforcing that perspective. That's really what social media does. So on the one hand, we have never been as connected to as many people and in different parts of the world as we are today. And our ability to access information, our ability to stay informed has never been greater. But at the same time, I also believe, particularly for younger generations, if you're under 40, we were just released some new data with the Canadian Medical Association that is just important to note that there's no one source of news or information that everybody captures today and reads. The media landscape is deeply fragmented. And then if you're relying on social media to get your news, odds are you're getting fed stuff that the algorithm knows you're going to like and engage with in the first place. So you're never, unless you choose to, and so few people actually are actively choosing to be exposed to ideas that might challenge them as opposed to reinforce them. And so you take that environment, you add in the anxiety that people are feeling about the world today, whether that be geopolitical conflict, whether that be climate change, whether that be the short-term sort of macro and microeconomic insecurity that they're feeling, and that zero-sum thinking mindset that we spoke about earlier, and you mash that all together, and it creates I think a toxic cocktail in which if you have political leaders who choose to take advantage of it, they can, and I think that the instinct is, you have these horrible instincts. I've found myself doing it sometimes on social media where you start typing something and you're like, if you just paused for a minute and you said, do I really want to tell the world and that person that? You probably would, our instincts just to sort of get that dopamine hit from engaging. So all of that, I think, is leading to a politics that does feel more divisive, that does feel like it's harder to bridge differences. And just to add to it, and I don't want to sort of go too deep into a rabbit hole here, I'm also fascinated by some research that political scientists in the United States, others are looking at about how our worldview actually is influencing the division that we see. And then there's a lot of research that says that there's typically two types of worldviews. One is in which people have an opened or what they call fluid worldview, and one that's more closed and fixed. And basically what they've shown, particularly in the United States, and I think it's starting to happen in Canada, is the political systems are realigning and sorting themselves around those two worldviews. And the simple way to describe both worldviews is one group of people sees the world as a generally open, kind of not so dangerous place. And so, that's how they start their engagement with whatever's coming their way. And then there's another group that are much more, and it's not a criticism of them. They just see the world as more dangerous, and they're much more resistant to change, right? And it's not a liberal, conservative, NDP, Sask party kind of divide. It's just simply an apolitical worldview that has, what's happened is in the United States, for example, is the party systems have basically captured. So the Democrats are basically a party of those who have more fluid and open worldviews, and the Republicans are more closed and fixed. And the result is, if you've got two very different worldviews, we can't actually talk to each other. We see the world in a different lens. And so I think all of that, everything I just said there, which is a long answer to your question, Sean, is mixing to create the kind of politics we feel is just not working right. And so I always come back to, and I'll end with this, as somebody who observes politics a lot, is I still believe that the ultimate responsibility lies with the leaders, and for them to be thinking about the choices they're making, and is the political benefit, the emotional and psychological benefit to doing some of this worth kind of dividing the country up, or the province or your municipality up into pieces, and us fighting amongst each other.
Across the province, SaskTel is engaged with many different municipal organizations who seek to innovate. Contact your SaskTel account manager to learn more about some of these initiatives and how they can help your municipality today.
That was a fantastic answer. What I really appreciate is, coming from a nonpartisan organization like SUMA, we're pretty focused on what things are good ideas in terms of implementation. And I think, I would hope that should really be how politics runs at the federal and provincial level as well. You're finding things that are good ideas, and everybody, despite coming from different views on how to get to an end game, if you will, I would hope that everyone's end game is still the best outcomes for Canadian citizens, even if we don't see that those are the same things from our different worldviews. And I also note that you come from a very nonpartisan perspective in the work that you do as well. And I wonder if you have any thoughts on how we can start to bridge the growing political divide and promote more constructive dialogue between individuals of these differing political views, so that we're once again focusing on whether you have a good idea or not, whether a policy problem is in fact solvable, or how we can solve it, rather than just taking those political shots. Is that something that you see as requiring change from political leaders at the top, or is that something that can be done more at the grassroots level to encourage those at the top to change?
Good question. I mean, I come from the perspective of, look, most people are entirely reasonable and aren't that deeply partisan, at least in Canada right now. Which tells me that fundamentally they're looking for their leaders, whether that be in government, whether that be in the business community, in the nonprofit or civil society, to help solve problems, to make their lives better. One of the things that worries me more about where I see both sort of the leader level versus the public is, and I'm seeing it on both sides, is, Sean, to your point, we have to agree on the problem before we can find common solutions. And I think increasingly we're disagreeing on what actually the problems are, which makes it hard for us to find common ground on public policy choices. So it's about understanding, again, and this is why I think there's real value in public opinion research, particularly around policy communication, policy design, because you have to understand where people are and what they think about things. We just as an example, we released some data earlier to look at perceptions around the carbon tax and pollution pricing, an issue that is deeply divisive in our country, right? And including in Saskatchewan. And what I learned was that, there's deep misunderstanding and perceptions that are shaping people's views of it. Whether, the rebate is as much as people pay into it, whether it's actually going to solve climate change or reduce emissions, right? There's deep perceptual differences that has a big impact on it. So I do think we can find common ground, and but it does require us to understand where people start and then build from there.
You mentioned earlier that there are several elections happening this year. We have the municipal election. What key points do you have for local governments to keep in mind as they're governing through this upcoming election year?
I think the starting point is just, again, understanding where people are coming from. And, when I ask the question, what's keeping you up at night? The most common response right now, and I suspect it will be throughout the year, which means it's going to be the key driver for how people are going to evaluate their choices in an election, about what issues are most salient, and that is affordability and the cost of living. It's been a long time. I've been doing public opinion research for almost 20 years, and I don't think I've come across a moment where so many people, like just almost a unity, we're almost all agreed that this is the problem that's confronting us. Now, for different people and different age groups, if you're younger, it might be more about housing and accessing a housing market. If you're older, it's about, you're on a fixed income and you don't know how you're going to, buy the groceries this week, or you're worried about rising costs of some, additional health services, or transit's getting more expensive, whatever it might be, right? That cost of living affordability challenge is there. And so I guess the thing to keep in mind, and I think most leaders I talk to, most elected officials understand it. They're pretty closely in touch with what their constituents are thinking, is to not ignore, is not to sort of say, well, that's not our fault. Right? I think that's every leader's, every politician's, let me say, instinct is to sort of blame something else. I actually think we need more leaders who are empathize and admit that, yeah, I wish we could do more, but there are limits to what we can do. And if you're a municipal leader, yeah, sure, you can point to the provinces and the feds having all the money and you're being very constrained. And I think you got to continue to, as FCM's doing, talk about, a new deal for cities and a framework that allows you to do the things that municipalities are being asked to do effectively, but to not lose sight of the fact that most people are coming at this through the perspective of, I'm just finding it harder to get by every day. And that's likely going to be the conversation that they're going to be wanting to have at the doors. And that's true at all three levels of government.
Do you have any advice for individuals who aren't engaged in local government or aren't considering running for election, but really want to stay informed about politics and are feeling overwhelmed by the vast amount of information available?
Yeah, I think politics can be intimidating. Sometimes those of us in it talk a certain way. We use words that like most normal people don't use. And I think that's true in any kind of field, right? Like in the same way that I feel about like engineers or astrophysicists when they talk about space and stuff. I don't know what they're talking about. But I do think that there are plenty of opportunities for anybody who wants to get involved in politics to do it. It's as simple as even getting involved. The great thing about municipal politics in Saskatchewan and in most other provinces is it's nonpartisan. So you don't have to feel like you're picking a side to get involved at the local level, which I think is a great introduction to, political activism, to getting involved in a campaign. And it doesn't need to be formal politics. It could be, getting more involved in a community association or a community group that's advocating for a particular issue. I think there's lots of opportunities to do it. And and this is my like kind of hopeful call to action-y part of this podcast, is there's evidence, by the way, that since the pandemic, we are actually retreating from engaging in our community. That if you look at a number of different indicators, whether it's attendance at, a church or religious institutions, involvement in organized sports, community active, all of those things are in decline. People are kind of staying home and they're they're isolating themselves. And I think that's going to have a long-term negative effect on our communities. So I do think getting involved generally and in politics can be helpful. At the end of the day, if you're somebody who thinks, look, politics is not for me, they're all a bunch of whatever word you want to use to describe them, as we sometimes hear, you can't fix it. You can't solve it unless you get involved. And I think the vast majority of people involved in politics, vast majority of your members, vast majority are good people who are trying to make a difference in their community. And you only learn that when you actually go out and work with them and engage with them. So that's my advice is like, it sounds hokey, I guess, to say, go out and get involved, but there's truth in you can't complain about something unless you get active and try to fix it. And that's been my perspective and view throughout my life too.
It's such a great point that you made about how it's just important to get out there and get involved, and that the vast majority of municipal leaders out there are really great people who are trying to make a difference in their communities, because we certainly see that every day here with the people that we're working with. So I wanted to thank you very much, David, for taking the time to speak with us today. This has been a really engaging conversation, and I'm looking forward to hearing your keynote at the 2024 SUMA Convention and Trade Show in Regina. Do you have any final comments that you'd like to leave our listeners with?
The only thing I will say, I'm going to do a little plug here. I have a newsletter, davidcoletto.substack.com. If you're interested in polling and public opinion and politics, you can subscribe to that. It might give you a little insight into the kinds of things I'm going to talk about at the convention in April. And other than that, Stephanie and Sean, this has been a real pleasure. I look forward to coming out to Regina. I love visiting Saskatchewan and meeting, not just presenting, but hopefully being able to meet a number of your members and others. And so if you see me in the hall, don't be shy and feel free to chat. And I look forward to that.
This brings us to the end of another episode of Municast. Have you been interested in learning more about what SUMA does and the resources that we have available to Saskatchewan's urban municipalities? Then make sure you tune in to Season 6, where we'll be answering the question, who is SUMA?